Good afternoon. We're just going to wait a few minutes to let people join. Hi, Tracy. Can you hear us now, Tracy? Yeah. Okay. So just while we're waiting for a few more people to join, I wonder if you could just share in the chat if you've ever been involved either in an adverse event or if you've been involved in investigating an adverse event. And, a couple of words to, what the experience was like for you. So while you're typing that, I'll just give you maybe my experiences. I mean, I've been involved both in adverse events. In fact, an adverse event was probably the first time that I decided I wanted to do quality improvement, because I saw an adverse event happening and I realized that it was going to happen again at some point in the future. And I wanted to try and do something about it. And I've also been involved in investigating adverse events. And once you see both sides of the coin, you realize just how small a part each individual has to play in the whole system of things. And although you can, when you're maybe involved in an adverse event, think that a lot of it is to do with you or to do with someone else, when you actually pick it all apart, you see that they're just a cog in a big, big machine. So yeah. So great. Well, we'll get started. I'm just going to share the screen. So yeah, today we're going to talk about adverse events. We're just going to talk about what adverse events are, the steps to take, and it's all about communication, really. So we're just going to talk about that, and then there's a video at the end which will be interesting to watch. So when something goes wrong in the clinical setting anyway, these are the main sort of things that we have to do, and it's pretty common sense. First of all, we care for the patient. So sometimes the patient needs immediate attention, if it's something really bad that's happened, or at least we need to make sure that they're not going to get into further harm. So that's the first step. Then second one is to communicate what's gone on, what's happening, and what's going to happen, because they may want lots of answers and we may not have them for them at the time, but we're going to tell them about the process that follows after this. And then it's about reporting it. So we can't learn from an adverse event unless we acknowledge that it's happened, and then communicate that with the wider organization so that we can get an understanding of the factors at play. So that's the reporting stage. And in Southern, we have Safety First, which is the best place to report everything. But unfortunately, the resources on the back end of that, looking at all those reports, is pretty skeletal, and we probably miss a lot of signals from the noise. So then step 4 is documenting what's happened, because later on when we come to investigate it, we rely heavily on that documentation to form a picture of what happened. And we'll go on to that in a minute. So why is communication difficult? Why do you think it's so hard to communicate after an adverse event? So just think for a moment, perhaps a patient has fallen on the ward, and it might have been because somebody should have been watching them and they weren't, or that there was a puddle of water and the cleaner forgot to clean it up, or it could have been just the patient was wandering by themselves and it was just an accident. But any of those situations, why is it difficult to communicate after an adverse event? Well, there's a lot of sort of things going on in the background, a psychological need to preserve a sense of yourself. So wondering whether you've done something wrong and whether you should face up to that. You might be scared that the patient's going to be angry, or that managers might be upset. You might even be fearful that you're going to lose your job or position. So if what you've done is potentially negligent, then that is going to stop you at all costs trying to communicate that out. Or there's a threat that you might be a whistleblower and you might be censored. That's actually a very real sort of fear for things that are particularly difficult to communicate about, like performance of other team members, the threat of medical malpractice or any other sort of malpractice claims. I mean, fortunately, we have ACC in this country, which actually stops a lot of that claiming stuff, but it still can happen. It's still a potential thing if there's any potential criminal action that's happened. Fear of colleague disapproval. So we all want to be within our communities accepted and approved, and speaking out against other people is obviously very difficult, and negative publicity. So there's lots of barriers to kind of speaking up and communicating openly about things that have not gone right. But probably one fundamental thing about adverse event investigation is you need to accept that no one is perfect. We're all humans, and humans make errors. And one thing I really love to really, a mantra that I kind of use when I'm going about my quality improvement work and patient safety work is that I start off from a place of default assuming that every person comes to work to try and do a good job. Nobody is coming to work to try and do a bad job. The chance of that is extremely rare. You do get them, and probably the most famous one is Harold Shipman, but it's not fair on the 99% of people who come to work to do a good job to treat them all like criminals. So it's best to assume that everybody is coming to work to do a good job. and that if things go wrong, it's with the best intentions behind them. So it's our responsibility to promote and maintain a learning environment and sort of like use that default, because that openness, it leads to more transparency. It leads us to find the root causes of problems and actually solve them rather than being defensive. So obviously communication is important, and probably the first people that we need to communicate with is the patients and families when things go wrong. In the UK, this has been coined the duty of candor, which came out after the Mid Staffordshire investigation into a lot of deaths that probably shouldn't have happened. And now there's a lot of sort of things that we hold, standards that we hold ourselves to that we didn't before. So one is the duty of candor, where if something goes wrong, you actually have a duty to tell the patient or the relatives of what's happened. And the other thing is that if you see something happening that's not appropriate, you have a duty to speak up. Because if the standard which you walk past is the standard which you accept. So if you're going to walk past it, you are to some extent complicit in that action or behavior that's gone on. So those are sort of like two key principles that we now sort of work around. You actually find that if communication is better, especially with patients, then they tend to sue less. And obviously that comes from other countries where suing is part of the culture, but it still works in a less litigious culture such as ours, where just being open and providing apologies and communication from the beginning leads to a lot less effort and investigations that can distract us. Say, for example, patients threatening to go to the HDC, even although we may not in the end suffer financially from an HDC investigation, there is a lot of time and effort and reputational harm that comes from these things. So why do patients sue, or why do they complain, or why do they push things to the HDC? It's when they're concerned about standards of care. It's when they need an explanation and they're getting nothing back. It's when they want compensation, and that's where ACC helps a lot. Just financial compensation, managing to help people deal with the expenses of whatever's happened. And they want accountability, so they feel like nobody is owning up. So a lot of these can be addressed with communication. So the general guiding principles about how you communicate is you do need to use judgment. You can use organizational policy to guide how you say things, but generally speaking, you can say sorry for things without necessarily admitting culpability. And a good way to go into those conversations, not having to admit culpability, is a systems understanding of the whole thing to begin with. Understanding that even though it may appear that one person is particularly responsible for something going wrong, you actually have a better understanding of the system behind it, and that it's very, very unlikely to be just one person's fault. So coming from that sort of perspective helps you to apologize to the patient without necessarily saying it's one person's fault. Timing matters. So yes, sometimes you delay telling a patient, especially if they're coping with recovering from medical harm, for example. But the earlier the better, basically. When it comes to near misses, you might not need to communicate that with patients, but I don't see any harm in not communicating it with patients either, because patients really do value open and honesty, and they may have a perspective that helps you with your quality improvement in the future. So by sharing a near miss with them, they may give you an insight that you didn't think about, and that actually leads to an improvement that makes a difference. So when communicating with patients, usually say what happened, how it's going to affect them, the immediate and long-term sort of prognosis. Empathy goes a long way. Saying the word sorry does not necessarily mean that you're accepting blame. It just means I empathize with your situation, and I want to do the best to help you out. Then the last thing is a follow-up. So tell them what's going to happen, how you're going to make this better, and how you're going to get back to them. But there does come a time when you maybe need to apologize, maybe not on behalf of an individual, but more so on the behalf of a team or in the organization. And I think it's very powerful to say, I'm sorry, we should have done this, for example. I remember one adverse incident I was involved with was in the outpatient clinic. And in the outpatient clinic, we use these rigid sigmoidoscopes to look inside people's bottoms. It's a colorectal clinic, so we're doing this to multiple patients. And the process is that the scope head gets cleaned every time. The scope head gets actually sent away for sterilization, and the tube that goes on it is disposable. But when they opened a packet for me and I used it, they didn't check it properly for sterility, and it turned out that the sterilization process had failed for 2 scopes. So there were 2 patients who were potentially exposed to infections, potentially, if the previous patient had had an infection. There's a potential for cross infection there. The risk was very low, but still, from a patient's perspective, to hear that you've had a potentially dirty instrument used on you in a very intimate manner would be alarming. But the patients that I spoke to, I talked to them about it, and they were very understanding, and just accepted that there would be a process to make sure that they're okay, and that happened, and then we sorted out our processes and then fed back to them what we'd done differently in the department to make sure the process doesn't happen again. So there we admitted responsibility. We say, sorry, we should have checked it and we didn't. And that goes a long way. So just think for a moment about some of these scenarios. How would you apologize in these situations? So say you borrowed your friend's favorite shirt and lost it, or say there are no beds in the hospital, so you had to cancel the patient's surgery, and that patient has traveled all the way from Wanaka in the morning, so pretty inconvenient for them. Or the third one, patient's husband has written to complain his wife, who is in hospital, is being ignored by the nurses, but in fact she's been pressing the call bell incessantly. So just think for a moment how you might approach these, and then I'll go through with you my thoughts on that. So you'd start off with an acknowledgement. I'm sorry that. An explanation. It happened because. Expression of remorse, shame, humility. This makes me feel. That's a really powerful sort of way to start. This makes me feel, because it's factual. Nobody can deny how you feel because you feel how you feel. But at the same time, it's not necessarily accusing anyone else of anything. So it's a really good way to show your humility and reparation. And because of this, we're going to do this. So that's the basic structure. So, for example, let's take the middle one, because I'm a surgeon and we tend to do this quite a bit. I'm sorry that I'm going to have to cancel your surgery today. We can't do it because we don't have enough beds in the hospital to care for you afterwards. And it happened because our hospital is at capacity and we had too many admissions from ED overnight. And it makes me feel frustrated and disappointed, because I know that you were really looking forward to getting this surgery out of the way and making you feel better. And going to do my best to try and get you in on my next list, but I can't make any promises, as you can understand. So it's a simple way of doing it. And another sort of key principle that I like to have in the back of the mind, that is, these are difficult conversations. And sometimes the best outcome from a difficult conversation is a feeling of dread or regret. You know, a difficult conversation doesn't necessarily feel all happy afterwards. So just because you or the patient is not happy afterwards doesn't mean you didn't do a good job, because difficult conversations are by their nature difficult. So that's just worth bearing in mind, because sometimes it's easy to kind of like really beat yourself up about it if the patient goes away really angry. But if you've done your best in a difficult situation, then don't use the patient's reaction as your measure of success when it comes to the difficult conversation. So if you were involved, how would you feel in these particular situations? And the last one is a new one that I added here. So say you administered 1,000 units of insulin instead of 10 to a critical patient, and the patient died because of the overdose. Well, obviously, you would feel pretty rotten about that, distraught. Some people leave the profession after such a bad mistake such as that. But in most cases, you would feel bad, you would feel remorseful, regretful, sad, all these things. I mean, there's plenty of things, but it can lead to, long-term adverse effects to yourself. So depression, I think, can actually lead to substance misuse. You can lose confidence in yourself. So that last example, I'm sure the next time you pick up an insulin or a syringe full of insulin, all those sort of fears come flooding back, and might make it actually difficult for you to do a safe job in the future just because of anxiety. So this leads us on to the notion of the second victim. So if something bad happens, the person who feels responsible in the situation, or the person who was responsible, can become a second victim, where it affects their job going forward, and we lose a functioning member of the workforce, for example. And that's also not a good thing, because not only does one patient who was involved in that adverse event suffer, but then potentially subsequent patients may suffer either from further problems or from the removal of that person from the workforce. So what we want to do is we want to reduce the impact of the adverse event on the second victim and subsequent patients of that second victim. So one thing, it's as I started off at the beginning, it's common to assign disproportionate blame to individuals. Either you assign it to yourself, or colleagues will assign it to you unfairly. And this is actually a cognitive mistake called the fundamental attribution error. And that's where we sort of focus on one particular negative thing and make that the most important thing, when actually there was many other factors involved. So we all have to be careful not to assign blame and to also care for people who seem to be blaming themselves unfairly. So that support begins with a team of people, including managers and supervisors, to identify this and actually debrief situations and to plan rehabilitation if necessary, you know, if it was a particularly serious incident. Yeah, maybe a phased return to work or just something other than, you know, some sort of formal support and plan in place to prevent it really becoming a long-term effect or somebody leaving the profession as a result of a mistake. Okay, so I wanted to show you a video of somebody potentially trying to apologize. So you might have seen this interview. You might have remembered the big furore, Will Smith, who got up on stage and assaulted Chris Rock in, I think it was the Oscars. Then Will Smith faced a lot of public backlash as a result of that. So this was his first interview, public interview, since that incident. Let's see how well he does in terms of apologizing. I'm just going to share the sound. And we'll leave it there. So interesting interview there, actually. I found that quite interesting. Just analyzing it from a point of view of, you know, if you had a platform to improve your reputation, you know, how would you go about that? Well, how do people think he did? Does anybody want to offer some comment?
I think we're all silent here. It's not that we're not listening. We're probably all thinking. It's Michelle Derritt here.
Hi, Michelle.
I think he did okay-ish, but there was no word of sorry. I really shouldn't have done that. It was more he was justifying why he was doing it. So yes, I think he did okay-ish, but he could have done much, much better.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely understand your comments there. So I agree. He's probably, I mean, he said sorry many times in the press before this interview. So maybe he thought in his mind, I've already said sorry. I don't need to keep saying sorry. I just need to now explain my side of the story. But you know, a lot of people will not have read any of the stuff before, and this will be the first time that they're hearing him speak, and this was the first time he actually spoke on camera. So I think if I was advising him how he was going to answer that question, I would have said, you got to just start with a sorry and, you know, apologize directly to Chris through the camera and say, I'm sorry I did that. You know, it's not, violence is never justified, and I wish I'd never done it, and show your regret and understanding, and then go on to say, what I'm going to do in the future is I'm going to look into why that happened and make sure it never happened again. And then go on to say, well, maybe, you know, I have been doing some deep diving and there was a lot going on for me at the time and I lost control of my emotions, etc. But at least you then framed all that initially with that sort of position. But yeah, it did seem like he was trying to justify his actions, whether or not he's actually trying to justify it or not. I don't think he was trying to justify it, but it came across like he was trying to say, cut me some slack. You know, you don't know what's going on in my life. And if you just only knew what was going on in my life, you would understand that this was not such a bad thing, or even that this was okay to do. So you can see how it's quite subtle how you communicate and how it comes across to other people. And even the richest people in the world who have a lot of reputation to lose or gain, and this is their job, is to be a celebrity and to be liked by people so that they'll come and watch their movies and listen to their music and stuff. And you've got all these advisors and media people at your fingertips. Your ego still gets in the way. And despite all that access to all that resource, you can still come up on an interview show here and do quite a bad job of it. And the history is littered with important leaders and celebrities making a really bad job of apologizing and just making their situation a whole lot worse. And then there's also some examples in history of where people have actually provided a really good apology, and it is completely turned around public opinion on them. So it's definitely an art, and on a much smaller scale, when it comes to patients, the same principles apply. You just need to show empathy and use the sorry word, and say what you're going to do in the future to make sure it doesn't happen again. And then anything you want to do to justify yourself, most of the time it's best not to. It's best just to leave that for later, and leave your apology completely separate to any sort of justification that comes later on why things happened. So there's some more things in the chat here. So CZS4, I don't know who you are, sorry. Hard to say, as I didn't really think it was an apology, but yes, as you say, saying his side of the story. Yeah, so agreement there. Oh, Claire, thanks. And Tracy saying that she didn't hear an apology at all from Will, and that people should be genuine. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. So that's all I wanted to share with you. Has anybody got any comments or questions about adverse events and how we go about them in Southern?
Michelle here again, and
Right.
I'll make the comment. As a social worker, I'm often the person who's sitting there after an apology's been given.
Right.
And kind of almost having to give another apology to a patient.
Right.
Sometimes it's because a patient's felt overwhelmed by what's gone on,
Mm-hmm.
or sometimes it's they haven't heard the whole message.
Mm-hmm.
And just need somebody to talk. But one of the things that I have also noticed is, I suppose, cancellations. Of the example you gave there around people turning up to surgery and it being cancelled.
Yeah.
And as a social worker, I sometimes find myself in the position to be the one that apologises, because I'm the one that has to talk about funding, you know, how we get somebody back into hospital next time and who's going to pay for it. And it's like, I often feel I'm not the right person, that it shouldn't necessarily have come from me, the apology.
Yeah.
But we are in the position to say, I'm so sorry this has happened, and yeah, the situation is out of our control. Yeah, I find that an interesting. I've been practiced at saying sorry, but often question myself whether I was actually the right person to be saying sorry. But then those that could be saying sorry are the ones that are so busy, which is the reason that surgeries or appointments have got cancelled in the first place.
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. Who is the person that's saying sorry when it's really no one's fault? And some people think it should be the surgeon, and I think there's a really good argument why it should be the treating clinician, and that's because they're the ones who have the biggest relationship with the patient, and they have the trust in the patient. And so they're the ones who are probably in the best position to make them feel at ease that things are going to happen and they're going to get their surgery eventually and they don't need to worry. And then that patient, if they spoke to their surgeon, is probably going to go home less angry and less anxious than if they spoke to anyone else. So I buy that. The problem is that surgeons often operating on someone else at the time. The other thing is that a lot of surgeons actually hate doing it because they feel it's not their fault. And they feel, I'm here to operate and it's the management's fault that there's no beds.
And so should it be managers saying sorry?
Yeah, so a lot of surgeons will actually make the managers go and do it. And then some of the managers actually feel, okay, no, it's my job because I'm in charge of the whole service. The surgeon's just one bit in my service, and the beds and all that stuff, it's not under their control, so it's my fault. But so you could think of it as the point of view of who's the most responsible. That might be the manager, or who's the best person to speak to the patient that's going to make them feel better, and that's probably the surgeon. So if you think of it from a patient's perspective, probably most people would agree it's the clinician. But at the same time, you got to also think, well, okay, from a patient's perspective, I want to hear sorry, but sorry isn't necessarily blaming people, because at the end of the day, blame's not going to get me anywhere. But what will make a patient feel better is if they're empathized with, and anybody can empathize with a patient and say, I know how you're feeling. This is so frustrating. I wish it didn't happen. If it was my mother in the same position, I would be very upset too. I'm with you. I hear you. I'm going to advocate for you in this system and try and make sure that you're okay. And that goes a long way too. So even although you maybe you're even, I don't know, an administrator who is a secretary and you've got nothing to do with the booking of the patient, even a sorry from them goes a long way, and it's much better than nobody saying sorry and kicking the patient out. So yeah.
I have been in a situation of having to say sorry to a patient. It's pediatrics, where the patient's been ready for surgery 4 times and it's getting cancelled, and it has nothing to do with our hospital. Yeah, it's trying to fly them up to Starship, and at the airport having to ring up and say, I'm sorry, this surgery has been cancelled. Yeah. And that is really hard when it happens time and time again. It gets to the point where the patient just dreads the phone call from the social worker, because they're the ones that are telling them that they're not getting on the flight this time again. Yeah. No, that is a difficult job, especially if all you bring is bad news. Yeah. No, I feel for you. That it seems to be ridiculous in those situations when it's the 4th time over, and No, thanks for sharing that. Any other comments? No, great. Okay, well, have a great afternoon, and thanks for participating, and see you next time. Okay. Cheerio. Bye.